The receipt for our anniversary dinner sat between us on the reclaimed oak table like a cooling corpse. But Mark wasn't looking at the bouquet of lilies I'd surprised him with. He was tapping a calculator app on his phone, his face set in a mask of clinical indifference that made my blood run cold. "Your share of the truffle fries and the sea bass comes to $64, and since I paid the tip, you owe me an extra $15 for the service," he said, sliding his phone toward me as if we were business rivals closing a grueling merger rather than a husband and wife of 5 years. It wasn't just the money, it was the fact that he was charging me for the privilege of sitting in the very house my grandfather had bequeathed to me, the same house where, only a year ago, Mark had promised to protect me until his final breath. Our life hadn't always been a series of line items and Venmo requests. For the first 4 years, we were the couple our friends envied, the kind that finished each other's sentences and shared a single, messy bank account without a second thought. We lived in a charming, slightly crooked Victorian on the edge of the city, a house that smelled of beeswax polish and the jasmine vines I'd spent 3 summers training to climb the porch. I remember the way the morning light used to hit the kitchen floor, turning the steam from our shared French press into a golden haze. Mark would wrap his arms around my waist while I fried eggs, whispering about the future, about the children we'd raise in these rooms, and how lucky he was that I'd brought this beautiful home into our marriage. I am a senior graphic designer, and for a long time, my steady income was the spine of our household, while Mark struggled to get his architectural firm off the ground. I never begrudged him a cent. When his first 3 projects fell through, I paid the mortgage, which was technically just the property taxes and insurance since the house was paid off, and I covered his car notes and his expensive taste in drafting software. I did it because we were a team. I loved the calloused feel of his hands and the way he looked when he was lost in a blueprint. He was my rock, or so I thought, and the house was our sanctuary, a gift from my grandfather who had worked 50 years in a steel mill to ensure I'd never be homeless. The first cracks didn't appear in our marriage. They appeared in the form of my mother-in-law, Eleanor. Eleanor was a woman who wore her bitterness like a designer scarf, elegant but suffocating. She had been wronged by a series of men and had raised Mark with the paranoid mantra that everyone was out to take what was his. For years, she was a manageable nuisance, someone who made passive-aggressive comments about the dust on the baseboards or my untraditional career. I tolerated her for Mark's sake, offering her tea in my best china and smiling through her lectures on how a wife should be a helpmate rather than a competitor. But 6 months ago, everything shifted. Mark's firm finally landed a massive contract for a new luxury development downtown. Suddenly, the man who used to count pennies for a movie night was wearing tailored suits and checking his reflection in every window. And with his success, Eleanor's influence grew like a shadow at sunset. She began visiting 3 times a week, her voice a low, constant hum in Mark's ear. I'd catch fragments of their conversations when I came home early from the studio. Words like asset protection, financial autonomy, and not letting her ride your coattails now that you're on top drifted through the vents. I noticed the change in the way Mark looked at me. The warmth was replaced by a strange, calculating squint, as if he were trying to figure out my net worth. He stopped asking how my day was and started asking about my client list and my projected earnings for the quarter. Then came the evening that changed everything. I had spent the day at a stressful gallery opening and came home expecting the usual comfort of our shared routine. Instead, I found Mark sitting at the dining room table with a stack of folders and his laptop open. Eleanor was there too, perched on the edge of the sofa like a vulture, sipping tea from my grandfather's favorite mug. "We need to talk about the future, Sarah," Mark said, his voice devoid of the usual affection. "With my new income bracket, the old way of doing things is inefficient. It's time we move to a split budget, 50-50 on everything, utilities, groceries, maintenance, and a fair market usage fee for the household expenses." I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest, a physical manifestation of my heart trying to shield itself. "A usage fee? Mark, this is my house. My grandfather left it to me. We don't even have a mortgage." Eleanor cleared her throat, a dry, rasping sound. Property taxes, insurance, and the wear and tear on the structure aren't free, dear. Mark is just being sensible. A man in his position has to be careful. It's about equity. Equity? I whispered, looking at Mark. We've been married for 5 years. I supported you for 3 of them. I didn't ask for a usage fee when you couldn't afford gas for your car. Mark didn't look me in the eye. He just tapped the folder. That was then. This is now. I've drafted a financial independence agreement. It's better this way. No more arguments about who spent what. We each pay our half, and what's left over stays in our individual accounts. It's the modern way, Sarah. Don't be emotional about it. The usage fee, he proposed, was nearly identical to what a high-end rental in this neighborhood would cost. He was, in effect, asking me to pay him for the privilege of living in the home I already owned, under the guise of shared household contributions. I looked at the spreadsheet, the cold, hard lines of it, and then at Eleanor's smug, thin-lipped smile. The air in the room felt thick, like I was breathing in ash. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to grip the back of a chair to keep from falling. My hands were shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that started in my fingertips and moved up my arms. This wasn't just a budget, it was a wall he was building between us, stone by stone, under his mother's careful supervision. "And if I don't sign this?" I asked, my voice barely a thread. Mark finally looked up, and for a second, I saw a flash of the man I'd married, a flicker of guilt in his eyes. But then he looked at Eleanor, and his expression hardened into granite. "Then I'll have to reconsider if our goals are truly aligned. I need a partner who understands the value of a dollar, Sarah, not someone who expects a free ride." The "free ride" comment felt like a slap. I had spent years building a life with him, pouring my sweat and my savings into our mutual happiness, and now he was treating me like a tenant he was looking for a reason to evict. I looked around the room, at the curtains I'd sewn by hand, at the books we'd collected together, and suddenly, the house didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a trap. I realized then that the man standing in front of me wasn't my protector. He was someone I didn't recognize at all. And as I picked up the pen to sign that hideous document, a cold, hard knot began to form in my stomach, a seed of something that wasn't love, and wasn't quite yet hate, but was the beginning of the end. The following 2 weeks were a masterclass in psychological erosion. The man who once surprised me with wildflower bouquets and breakfast in bed was replaced by a human ledger. Every interaction was tainted by the cold, digital ping of a Venmo notification. If I bought a carton of organic eggs, I'd receive a request for $3.50 before I'd even finished making the omelet. If the heating bill went up by $20 because of a cold snap, Mark would present me with a printed graph showing the excessive consumption and demand I adjust my usage habits to stay within the 50-50 split. I tried to tell myself it was just a phase, a side effect of his sudden climb into the high-stakes world of urban architecture. "He's just stressed," I told my reflection in the mirror, though the dark circles under my eyes told a different story. But then, the whispers began. Eleanor started showing up while I was working in my home studio, drifting through the hallways like a pale ghost, touching the crown molding and measuring the windows with a retractable tape measure that sounded like a gunshot every time it snapped shut. "What are you doing, Eleanor?" I asked one afternoon, standing in the doorway of my own living room, feeling like an intruder. She didn't even turn around. "Just assessing the potential, dear. This house has good bones, but it's vastly undervalued. Mark needs to ensure his investments are protected. A man of his caliber can't have his capital tied up in a property he doesn't officially influence." "Influence?" My voice shook. "This is my home. There is no capital to protect. He pays a contribution for living here, just like I do." She turned then, a thin, predatory smile stretching her lips. "For now, but things change, Sarah. The world doesn't reward those who sit still." That evening, I tried to confront Mark. He was sitting in his study, a room I'd painted myself as a birthday gift to him, surrounded by expensive architectural models. "Mark, why is your mother measuring the windows? Why is she talking about influence over my grandfather's house? He didn't look up from his screen. She's just helping me with some long-term planning, Sarah. Don't be so paranoid. It's for the benefit of the unit. That's what we are now, remember? A financial unit. We're a marriage, Mark, not a hedge fund, I shouted, but he just reached over and turned up the volume on his noise-canceling headphones, effectively erasing me from the room. The point of no return came on a Tuesday. Mark had left for an emergency site visit and had forgotten his leather briefcase, the one I'd bought him to celebrate his first big contract. As I moved it to the side of his desk to clean, a thick manila folder slid out and hit the floor. The contents spilled across the hardwood: spreadsheets, legal correspondence, and a document with a heading that made my heart stop. Strategy for Equitable Interest Acquisition, 412 Maple Street. I dropped to my knees, my breath hitching in my throat. My hands were so cold they felt numb as I shuffled through the pages. It wasn't just a budget. It was a roadmap for a hostile takeover of my own life. There were invoices, dozens of them, for consultation fees paid to Eleanor's private consulting firm, all funded by the usage fees I had been paying Mark. There were notes from a real estate attorney discussing sweat equity and substantial financial contribution to property maintenance as a basis for a title claim. But the most devastating piece of evidence was a printed email chain between Mark and Eleanor from 3 months ago. "She's too comfortable, Mark," Eleanor had written. "If she owns the roof over your head, she has the power. You need to create a paper trail of financial responsibility. Once we can prove you've been the primary provider for the home's upkeep and taxes for a sustained period, we can file for a partition or a joint title claim. The usage fee is the key. Make her pay for her own house and use that money to buy your way onto the deed." Mark's reply was short. "Agreed. I'll start the split budget protocol on Monday. She'll complain, but she's sentimental. She won't leave. By next year, the house will be half mine, legally and on paper. Thanks, Mom." The room began to spin. A high-pitched ringing erupted in my ears, drowning out the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea and had to crawl to the bathroom, clutching the edge of the porcelain sink as I gasped for air. My skin felt too tight for my body. The man I had shared my bed with, the man I had supported when he had nothing, was systematically trying to steal the only thing I had left of my family. He wasn't just splitting the budget, he was using my own money to hire lawyers to take my house away from me. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, pale, trembling, a victim in her own home. The usage fee wasn't a contribution, it was a ransom. Every dollar I had Venmo'd him was a brick in the wall they were building to shut me out of my own life. I didn't cry. The tears felt like they had been flash-frozen in my ducts. Instead, a strange, terrifying clarity settled over me. The shaking in my hands stopped, replaced by a deadly, rhythmic pulse. I looked down at the documents again, specifically at the maintenance receipts Mark had been forging. He'd claimed to have spent $30,000 on a new roof and foundation work that had never been done. He was building a mountain of lies, and he'd left the map right on his desk. I carefully gathered the papers, making sure every page was back in the exact order I'd found it. I tucked the folder back into the briefcase and placed it on the desk at the precise angle it had been before. My movements were slow and deliberate, like a person walking through a minefield. I walked out of the study and into the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water, my mind racing. He thought I was sentimental. He thought I was weak because I loved him. He thought he could use my grandfather's legacy as a pawn in his mother's sick games. "Okay, Mark," I whispered to the empty, quiet kitchen. "You want a split budget? You want to play by the rules of financial independence? Let's play." I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Hi, Uncle David? It's Sarah. I remember you saying you have a friend who specializes in forensic accounting and predatory real estate law. I think I need to hire him. Immediately!" As I hung up, I felt a cold, sharp edge settle in my chest. The Sarah who had signed that agreement 2 weeks ago was dead. The woman standing in her place was a stranger, even to herself, and she was about to show Mark exactly what happens when you try to evict a woman from her soul. For the next week, I became an actress in the most grueling play of my life. I continued to pay the usage fees with a steady hand, even as my forensic accountant, a man named Elias with skin like parchment and eyes like a hawk, began unearthing the true scale of the rot. Every evening, I sat across from Mark at the dinner table, listening to him drone on about his firm's expansion, while in my pocket, my phone held photos of bank statements showing he'd been funneling my contributions into a private offshore account managed by his mother. The first additional twist came on Thursday. Elias called me, his voice tight with professional indignation. "Sarah, it's not just the title claim. He stopped paying the property taxes. For the last 2 quarters, despite the money you gave him for the split budget, he's let the debt accumulate. He's waiting for a tax lien to be filed. If the house goes to a tax sale, he's positioned an LLC, registered in Eleanor's name, to buy it for pennies on the dollar. He's not trying to get on the deed, Sarah. He's trying to wipe your ownership out entirely." The second twist felt like a physical blow to the stomach. Elias had tracked a series of large wire transfers from Mark's account to a local fertility clinic. Mark had told me he wasn't ready for kids yet, that we needed to stabilize our finances before starting a family. But the clinic records showed he'd been paying for egg freezing and storage for another woman, a junior associate at his firm named Chloe. He wasn't just planning to steal my house, he was planning to move his new family into it once I was gone. I didn't break. I waited for Friday night, the night of their celebratory dinner for Mark's latest contract. I invited Eleanor, insisting we needed to toast to our new financial harmony. The atmosphere in the dining room was thick with unspoken malice. Eleanor sat in my mother's chair, draped in silk, looking at me with a triumphant glimmer in her eyes. Mark was flushed with wine, acting the part of the successful patriarch. "I've made a decision about the split budget," I said, setting my fork down with a deliberate click. The sound echoed in the room. Mark smiled, a patronizing, thin-lipped expression. "I'm glad, Sarah. It's about maturity. I knew you'd see reason once you got over the initial emotion." "Oh, I'm very much over the emotion," I replied, sliding a thick blue folder across the table. "In fact, I've decided to increase my contribution. I'm paying for a full legal audit of this household. Why don't you open it, Mark?" He laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" "Open it," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register. As Mark flipped through the pages, his face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. Eleanor reached for the folder, but I slammed my hand down on it. "Not yet, Eleanor. Let's let the architect admire the blueprints of his own destruction first." "Sarah, this is a misunderstanding," Mark stammered, his eyes darting to the door. He looked smaller, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big. "I can explain the tax payments. I was just consolidating funds." "Consolidating them into Eleanor's LLC? Or were you consolidating them into Chloe's IVF treatments?" I asked. The silence that followed was absolute. Mark dropped the papers, his hands shaking so violently he had to tuck them under the table. He didn't look at me. He didn't defend himself. He just stared at the salt shaker as if it held the secrets of the universe. Eleanor, however, didn't have the grace to be silent. She leaned forward, her face contorting into a mask of pure venom. "You think you're so clever, don't you? This house was wasted on a girl like you. Mark is a man of stature now. He deserves a home that reflects that, not a crumbling museum to a steel mill worker. We were simply doing what was necessary to protect his future. You're a footnote, Sarah, a temporary convenience." "A footnote who owns the land you're sitting on," I retorted. "Mark, look at me." He wouldn't. He just kept his head down, mumbling, "We can talk about this later, Sarah. Not in front of my mother. Let's just calm down and talk later." "There is no later," I said, leaning in. "You forced a split budget because you wanted financial independence. Well, congratulations, you've got it. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, I've filed an emergency injunction and a restraining order based on financial elder abuse, since the house was a family heritage, and fraud. But more importantly, I've changed the terms of our agreement. You can't do that, Eleanor hissed. We have a signed contract. A contract based on fraudulent misrepresentation of maintenance costs, I said, smiling for the first time in weeks. And since Mark hasn't paid the property taxes he claimed to be covering, he's in breach. In fact, he's been a tenant who hasn't paid his true share. I've calculated the back rent for the 5 years you lived here for free, Mark, while I paid for your cars and your software. It comes to $280,000. I'll see you in court for the rest, but for now, I pulled a second set of papers from under my chair. These are eviction notices. For both of you. You have 1 hour to pack a suitcase. The police are already at the end of the driveway, waiting for my signal. Mark finally looked up, his eyes wet and pathetic. Sarah, please, it's me. It's Mark. I love you. My mother, she convinced me this was the only way to be equal. I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to hurt me? You were planning to move another woman into my grandfather's bedroom while you stole my inheritance, I said, my voice crackling with a cold, sharp fury. The equal part of this marriage died the moment you put a price tag on my love. Now get out of my house before I have you carried out in handcuffs. You're being hysterical! Eleanor screamed, standing up so quickly her chair toppled over. You'll regret this. We'll tie you up in litigation for a decade. You'll be broke before you ever see a dime. Actually, Eleanor, I said, standing up to meet her gaze, I've already frozen the offshore account. Turns out your consulting firm didn't pay its own taxes. The IRS is much faster than a divorce court. I'd worry less about my house and more about your prison cell. Mark reached out to touch my arm, a desperate, fawning gesture. Sarah, honey, let's just sit down. I'll fire Chloe. I'll give it all back. Please, I have nowhere to go. I stepped back, looking at him with a profound sense of disgust. He wasn't the man I loved. He was a hollow shell filled with his mother's greed. Then I suggest you find a very cheap hotel, Mark, because according to your own budget, you can't afford me anymore. The arrival of the police was a quiet affair, which somehow made it more devastating for Mark. He had spent months cultivating the image of a high-powered architect, a man of unassailable status. Seeing him stand on the manicured lawn of the house he tried to steal, clutching a hastily packed duffel bag while a young officer checked his ID, was the most satisfying piece of performance art I had ever witnessed. Eleanor was screeching about rights and legal recourse, until the officer politely informed her that as a guest who had overstayed her welcome and was now named in a fraud investigation, her best move was to remain silent. I watched them from the porch, the jasmine vines swaying gently in the evening breeze. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel heavy with their presence. It felt clean. As the patrol car pulled away and their silhouettes faded into the streetlights, I felt that internal click settle into a permanent, icy resolve. I wasn't the grieving wife anymore. I was the warden of my own life. The next 3 months were a whirlwind of cold, calculated maneuvers. I didn't just want them gone. I wanted the split budget philosophy to be their epitaph. My lawyer, a woman who specialized in high-asset divorces and financial coercion, was a shark in a pinstriped suit. We didn't just file for divorce. We sued for the return of every cent I had spent supporting Mark's firm during his lean years, reclassifying those payments as personal loans rather than marital support, based on his own financial independence agreement. If he wants everything to be 50-50, my lawyer said with a predatory grin, then he owes you for half of every mortgage payment, every utility bill, and every grocery run you covered from year 1 to year 4, with interest. The retribution was total. I didn't stop at the bank accounts. I sent a copy of the forensic audit, along with the evidence of his forged maintenance receipts, to the senior partners at his architectural firm. They were a prestigious group who prized ethics and legacy above all else. Finding out that one of their rising stars was attempting to embezzle equity from his own wife while funneling company-related usage fees into an offshore account was enough. Mark was fired within 48 hours, his golden goose contract handed to the very rival he had spent months mocking. Chloe, the junior associate he'd been grooming to replace me, proved to be as transactional as Mark had become. The moment his income vanished and his reputation hit the pavement, she disappeared, taking the IVF records and his remaining pride with her. He tried to call me then, his voice a pathetic, wavering mess on my voicemail. "Sarah, please," he'd sobbed. "I'm staying in a studio apartment with no heat. My mother's assets are frozen, and I have nothing. This isn't who I am. It was the pressure, the success. I just got lost. Can we just talk? For old time's sake?" I didn't call him back. Instead, I had my lawyer send him a Venmo request for $15. The memo line read, "Share of the truffle fries from our last anniversary. Pay up!" Eleanor fared even worse. The IRS investigation into her consulting firm unraveled a decade of tax evasion and money laundering. She had been using Mark's contributions to cover the holes in her own crumbling finances for years. She wasn't a mastermind. She was a desperate, bitter woman who had raised her son to be her retirement plan. Watching her house go into foreclosure was the final, grim chapter of her influence over our lives. 6 months later, the dust has finally settled. I am sitting on my back porch, the same one where Mark once promised to protect me. The house is quiet now, but it's a good kind of quiet, the kind that allows you to hear the birds in the morning and the wind in the eaves. The Victorian bones of this place no longer feel like a trap. They feel like a fortress. I've spent the last few weeks stripping the wallpaper Mark chose and repainting the rooms in colors that make me feel light. I kept the reclaimed oak table, but I sanded it down, removing the finish where that receipt had sat between us. It's a clean slate now. Sometimes, when I'm making coffee in the morning, I find myself looking at the empty space where Mark's expensive espresso machine used to sit. I bought a simple, high-quality French press, the kind I used to share with the man I thought he was. But I don't miss him. I miss the girl I was before I had to learn how to fight, but I think I like this version of me better. She's stronger, she's wiser, and she knows exactly what her life is worth. My forensic accountant called me yesterday to tell me the final settlement had cleared. Mark will be paying me back for the next 15 years, a monthly reminder of the usage fee he thought he could extort from me. It's a small price for him to pay for the education I gave him. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. The jasmine is in full bloom now, filling the air with a scent so sweet it almost makes you forget how sharp the thorns can be. I looked out over my garden, my house, and my future, and I realized that the best thing Mark ever did for me was try to take it all away. He taught me that I didn't need a rock to lean on. I am the mountain. I set my mug down and smiled, a genuine, peaceful expression that didn't need to be shared with anyone to be real. In the end, the budget wasn't about the money at all. It was about the cost of a soul, and I'm finally out of debt. Because some things in this life are truly priceless, and a woman's peace of mind is the only asset that really matters. Mark wanted a split budget, and that's exactly what he got. He got his half of the nothing he brought to the table, and I got the rest of my life. And for the first time in 5 years, the books are finally balanced.